They didn't just kick me out, they erased me. One lie from my little brother, and at 17 I was standing outside my own home with a backpack and a bruise I didn't cause. 12 years later, after building a life from nothing, after clawing my way into the version of success they never believed I'd reach, my parents suddenly want to make amends. No apology, no accountability, just entitlement wrapped in a smile. And they expect me to forget what they did. But I haven't, and I won't. My name is Cassian Vale, and this is the part of my life I've never said out loud before. Before I share my story, I want to know you're here with me. Just say listening in the comments or tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far my story can reach. Sometimes even the smallest connection can make a story feel heard. Thank you. And now, here's my story. And if you're new here, please take a second to subscribe. Stories like mine aren't easy to tell, but your support helps me keep going. I'm Cassian, and I'm grateful you're here. I was sitting in my attic-level office in Portland when the call came in. Morning light spilled across my desk and glinted off the six-figure contract a tech company had just approved. I was tightening the final lines in their brand strategy, the kind of work that once felt impossible, when my phone vibrated. The name on the screen froze everything inside me, Mother. I hadn't seen that word attached to her on my phone in 12 years. My hand hovered above the device but didn't touch it. Something old and buried shifted in my chest, a pressure I hadn't felt since I was a teenager. My heartbeat stuttered, my palms cooled, and my throat tightened the way it used to whenever the house back in Santa Fe went suddenly quiet, before it exploded into shouting. It amazed me how quickly the body remembered danger. I stared at the screen, unable to breathe properly. All it took was her name to rewind my mind like a snapped cord, dragging me back to the night everything in my life split in half. The wind in Santa Fe had howled through the cracks of our old windows, my mother had cried in the hallway. My father's voice had broken through the walls like a verdict, and I had understood too young but too late that I had never been the son they wanted to keep. I let the phone ring until it fell silent. Then I declined the call. I knew it wasn't random. 2 days ago, my TEDx talk went viral, and my career, my story of clawing my way out of nothing, had been everywhere online. Reporters, CEOs, strangers, all of them wanted pieces of the life I had built. I didn't need anyone to explain why my parents suddenly needed me too. It wouldn't be about love. It never was. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the tall window overlooking Portland's gray sky. My reflection stared back at me, older, steadier, someone who had learned to breathe without permission. The past hadn't disappeared. It had simply waited. And now, with one phone call, it was reaching for me again. I was 17 the night everything unraveled. I had just finished a long day at my high school in Santa Fe, exhausted, sand still clinging to my jacket from the windstorm rolling through town. I remember pushing open the front door and hearing shouting before I even stepped inside. It wasn't unusual, but the tone was different, sharper, frantic. When I walked into the living room, Jake was hunched over, cradling his arm dramatically, his face twisted in counterfeit pain. Behind him on the wall was a fresh dent, fist-sized and perfectly placed for the performance he was staging. My mother rushed to him instantly, her hands fluttering over him like he was made of glass. My father stood stiff, jaw tight, looking at me as if I were a stranger who'd broken into his home. Jake didn't hesitate. He said I'd snapped. That I'd grabbed him, shoved him, then punched the wall in a fit of anger. My mother clung to him, her eyes wide with fear. My father's stare burned straight through me. I said it wasn't true. I tried to explain. But my voice shook, not because I was lying, but because I knew deep down that none of them would ever believe me over him. Jake had always been the perfect one. Charming, brilliant, admired, a walking trophy case of every quality my parents valued. I wasn't jealous, I had just learned early that in our house, perfection was currency, and Jake had the only wallet that counted. No matter what I did, no matter how honest I was, he was the sun they orbited. I was just the shadow that proved his light. So when he accused me, I saw the decision forming in my father's eyes long before he said a word. It didn't matter if it made no sense. It didn't matter that I'd never once been violent. It mattered only that Jake said it happened. My father's voice dropped like a sentence being passed. He told me I had 1 hour to pack my things and leave the house. My mother didn't protest. She didn't even ask what had actually happened. She just pulled Jake closer, as if I were the threat. I stood there waiting, hoping for someone to question the story. But the silence that followed was worse than yelling. It told me I had never belonged there, not in the way a son should. When I went to my room to gather what little I had, I crossed paths with Jake in the hallway. Our parents weren't watching then. His tears were gone, and on his face was a small, satisfied smile, a victory smile. His voice didn't need to say the words, his eyes already had. Everything suddenly clicked: the dent in the wall, the timing, the way he held his arm just enough to look wounded but not enough to hide the smirk. The wind outside howled as I stepped out with a single backpack slung over my shoulder. Sand stung my face, the night swallowing the house I had lived in my entire childhood. But I didn't look back. In that moment, I wasn't their son anymore. I was a kid with no family, no home, and no idea where the road ahead would lead, only that I would walk it alone. I took the last bus that night, the kind that rattled along the desert roads toward Taos, where my grandmother Helena lived in a small cabin tucked between tall pines. By the time I stepped off, it was close to midnight. The air was cold enough to sting my cheeks, my clothes were soaked from the storm I'd walked through, and every part of me felt drained in a way I hadn't known a person could feel. Still, I climbed the steps to her porch and knocked. She opened the door before I could knock again. She didn't ask what happened, didn't search my face for guilt or innocence. She just reached for me, pulled me inside, wrapped a towel around my shoulders, and handed me a mug of something hot. The warmth hit me harder than the cold ever had. When she finally asked if I wanted to talk, I told her everything, every detail, every word Jake said, every look on my parents' faces. She didn't question a single piece of it. She sighed quietly when I finished, the kind of sigh that told me she already knew more than she'd ever said. She told me she had seen Jake manipulate people before, even as a child, but my parents brushed it off because he was the one they'd built their hopes on. I didn't feel vindicated hearing that, just tired enough that when she pressed a folded stack of bills into my hand, I couldn't speak. It was only $150, the kind of money someone saves slowly over years, but to me it felt like a lifeline. Then she set a small leather notebook on the table along with a pen. She slid them toward me and said, "Write your truth. Don't let anyone else decide what your story is." I didn't understand then how much that moment would change the course of my life. But I felt something unlock inside me, something that had been waiting to breathe. When the house had quieted and she had gone to bed, I lay on the old sofa beneath a faded quilt, staring up at the wood beams above me. Everything I'd known was gone. The weight of that felt crushing at first, but as the room settled around me, I realized something else: I didn't belong to the Vale household anymore. I wasn't their scapegoat or their afterthought. I was someone who could start again. I opened the notebook. My hands were still shaking, but I wrote anyway. I wrote the first sentence of my life without them. Then another. And another. It wasn't pretty or poetic, but it was mine. It was the beginning of a vow I would get out, and I would do it without needing anything from them ever again. Before I drifted into sleep, my phone buzzed on the floor beside me. One message. From my mother. "Don't come back until you fix your attitude. No concern, no curiosity. Just dismissal, like she was closing a door that had never really been open." I set the phone face down, pulled the notebook against my chest, and closed my eyes. In the dark, with the sound of wind moving through the pines, I promised myself that I would never let anyone silence me again. I left Taos a month later with everything I owned: one bag of clothes, $150, and the notebook my grandmother had given me. Tucson seemed like a place where no one knew me, and no one cared enough to ask questions, which was exactly what I needed. I rented a room in a rundown complex with peeling paint and rusted pipes, the kind of place where people came and went without leaving traces. It became my starting point. I worked every job I could find. I delivered food in the heat-washed dishes until my fingers blistered, and took overnight shifts at a 24-hour diner. I slept on a thin mattress on the floor, waking up stiff every morning, but at least it was a roof over my head. I told myself that survival counted as progress. One night as I was biking to work, I passed two co-workers talking behind the restaurant. They didn't see me, but I heard every word. They said I looked pathetic, said they'd heard I'd been kicked out for losing control, and that no one should be surprised. They'd heard it from someone who knew Jake. That was when I understood something painful, but simple. My family's lies had followed me out of Santa Fe. Even here in a different city, I couldn't outrun the story they'd written about me. I realized I needed something they couldn't touch. Education felt like a door I hadn't tried yet, so I took the GED exam and enrolled in a community college. It wasn't glamorous. I went to class half awake, scribbling notes while my hands still smelled of fryer oil, then went home to collapse on my mattress. But every night before I slept, I wrote in the notebook. It kept me from falling apart. In creative writing class, Professor Winters stopped me after reading one of my essays. She told me I had something real in my voice, something sharp and honest. It was the first time in years an adult looked at me like I wasn't broken. But later, during a group discussion, a classmate said he recognized my last name. He said people in Santa Fe talked about a troubled kid from the Vale family. He didn't say it to hurt me, but it cut just the same. The past wasn't done with me. Still, the first time I got paid for my writing $40 for a short piece on a local website, something shifted. It wasn't just money. It was evidence that I had worth outside the story my family built around me. I kept writing. I kept submitting. And slowly, something like hope began to form. Then one afternoon, I got a message from an unfamiliar number. "Hope you're doing well after everything you caused." I didn't need a name to know who it came from. It had Jake written all over it, his tone, his cruelty, his confidence that no one would ever hold him accountable. I couldn't prove it, but I didn't need to. The truth was clear. I looked around my small room with its cracked walls and flickering light, the life I was scraping together piece by piece. I wasn't where I wanted to be, but I wasn't who I used to be either. I was becoming someone who could survive without their approval, someone who could build a future they couldn't destroy. I closed the notebook after writing that thought down. It felt like a line drawn in the sand, one that separated the boy they threw away from the man I was becoming. And for the first time since leaving Santa Fe, I believed I could outrun the lies. I believed I could become someone they couldn't take anything from. I got the email on a Wednesday evening after my shift at the diner. A small startup in Portland wanted to interview me for a writing position. I stared at the message for nearly a minute, wondering if it was meant for someone else. I checked my bank balance, $60. It was everything I had left in the world. I used 42 of it on a bus ticket that would take 28 hours and prayed the gamble wouldn't leave me stranded in another unfamiliar city with nothing. The ride felt endless. I slept sitting up, clutching my backpack to my chest like it was the one thing tying me to a future I refused to give up. At rest stops, I stretched my legs, splashed water on my face, and told myself this discomfort was temporary. I'd lived through worse. The next morning, I walked into the startup's office, small space, mismatched desks, and the faint smell of burnt coffee. But to me, it looked like possibility. The interview was going smoothly until one of the team members leaned back in his chair and asked, "Your family still in Santa Fe?" We came across some old posts online. I felt my throat tighten. I knew exactly what he'd found. The lies Jake spread when I was 17 had seeped into every corner of the internet. My name was still attached to stories that painted me as someone unstable. I forced myself to stay composed, answer their questions, and hope they would judge me by who I was in the room, not by rumors left behind by people who never wanted me to succeed. When they emailed later that day to say I'd been hired, I nearly collapsed with relief. I moved into a tiny room in southeast Portland, barely big enough for a mattress and a folding table that served as my desk. I wrote constantly articles, blog posts, short brand pieces, anything that could help me prove my value. I picked up extra freelancing, wrote deep into the night, and slowly began to feel like writing was more than survival. It was shaping me into someone new. Then something unexpected happened. A piece I wrote about personal branding was shared online more than 10,000 times. My inbox flooded. Companies reached out wanting help with strategy, identity, messaging. For the first time, I wasn't just a content writer. I was someone people sought out for clarity and direction. But success had a way of stirring the past. A former classmate from Santa Fe messaged me out of nowhere. "Your family says you're lying about what happened. They're talking about going public." My stomach sank. Even now, even after all the years, they couldn't allow my success without trying to reclaim the narrative. I pushed forward anyway. I traveled to Seattle to speak at a small conference, the first time I stood on a stage and told strangers what happened when I was 17. I expected skepticism. What I got was silence, the kind that meant people were truly listening. When I finished, they applauded not out of sympathy but understanding. It was the first time I felt the full weight of my story transform into something more than pain. I flew back to Portland with a realization that settled deep in my chest. The more visible I became, the harder the past would try to claw its way back. But unlike the boy I'd been, I now carried my own voice, and it was finally louder than theirs. The video from my Seattle talk spread quickly, far faster than anything I'd posted before. Within days, I received hundreds of messages from people who saw themselves in my story and invitations from companies wanting to collaborate. For the first time, my life was shifting so fast I could barely keep up. I tried to enjoy it, but part of me waited for the shadow I knew was coming. It arrived on a quiet morning in the form of a text from my mother. "We want to see you. It's been too long." 12 years of silence broken only when the world suddenly cared about what I had to say. I stared at the words for a long time, debating whether responding would reopen wounds I had spent over a decade stitching shut. But some part of me needed to know what they wanted, so I agreed. We met at a cafe downtown. When they walked in, I barely recognized them, older, tired, but still carrying the same air of certainty that had made them impossible to confront when I was young. They sat across from me like nothing had happened, like we were a family catching up after months, not a lifetime. My mother said they missed me. My father said I should come back into the family. Both danced around the truth, careful never to mention the night they threw me out at 17. Their words felt hollow, rehearsed. Eventually, the conversation shifted and the real purpose surfaced. They needed money, more than $60,000 to repair their home and help Jake recover from a failed business he'd poured their savings into. My name had appeared online, attached to new clients, new success, new opportunities, so suddenly I mattered again. Not as a son, but as a resource. I sat back and looked at them, really looked. They hadn't returned for reconciliation. They had returned for access. I told them I would consider helping under one condition: they convene a full family gathering and tell everyone the truth about what happened years ago. That Jake had lied. That I had been pushed out based on a story built to protect him. I needed to hear them say it, not in private, not as a whispered half-apology, but honestly and openly. My mother's face paled. My father's stiffened. They exchanged uncomfortable glances before insisting such a thing wasn't necessary, that it would humiliate Jake, that it would stir up drama. My father accused me of being selfish. My mother begged me not to make them choose between their sons. They still didn't understand they had already made that choice long ago. I stood, gathered my coat, and told them I didn't believe our story was finished in the way they hoped. When I walked out, I didn't feel anger or grief. I felt clarity. For the first time, the balance of power had shifted and they sensed it. I had proof. I had presence. I had a voice they couldn't mute anymore. As the cafe door closed behind me, the cold air hit my lungs like a reminder. This wasn't just a family matter anymore. This was about a truth buried for 12 years and the people who would rather lose me than let it surface. And I knew as I walked down the street toward my apartment that the next chapter of my life would not be written by them. It would be written by me. After the meeting at the cafe, I knew they wouldn't disappear quietly. Within a day, cousins and distant relatives began messaging me. They said my parents had already started repeating a familiar story, one where I had abandoned the family for money, where they were the wounded ones, and I was the ungrateful son who turned his back the moment success came. Hearing it again after so many years felt like stepping into an old room where the air still smelled the same. Their version of events was always the one they tried to bury the truth beneath. That night, my phone buzzed with a number I knew too well. Jake. His message was sharp, laced with the same contempt he'd carried since we were kids. He said I was performing for attention, that no one in the family would ever believe me. I was about to put the phone down when the last line stopped me cold. "I'm the one who hit the wall that day, but you were always the one causing trouble." For a moment, my heartbeat stalled. I read the line again to make sure I hadn't imagined it. In 12 years, he had never slipped, never let a single crack appear in the story he built to protect himself. Now, he had written the truth in his own words. I took a screenshot instantly, then another, and another. I opened the drawer where I kept everything from my years in Taos, my notebook from age 17, the photo of the wall taken hours after the incident, the recording I made years ago of my grandmother explaining what she witnessed. I laid them on my desk, letting the pieces assemble themselves. For the first time, the truth wasn't just something I remembered. It was something undeniable, something whole. I called Melissa, the attorney I trusted most. When I read the message out loud, she went silent for several seconds before saying, "Cassian, this is what you've been waiting for. They can't rewrite this." She asked if I wanted to file a case, but I already knew the answer. A lawsuit would drag me back through years of pain. I didn't want revenge. I wanted clarity. I wanted the truth laid bare in front of everyone who had ever dismissed me. So I sat down and wrote an email addressed to every relative on both sides of the family. People I'd barely spoken to. People who only knew rumors. I told the story plainly, without anger, without accusation. I attached everything: the screenshot from Jake, my old journal pages, the photo of the wall, the recording of my grandmother. When I finished, I hovered for a moment, not out of doubt, but out of recognition. This wasn't about proving myself. It was about ending silence. I clicked send. Within hours, replies poured in. Some said they'd always suspected something didn't add up. Others apologized for believing the version of events they'd been told years ago. A few admitted they cried reading the evidence. Their messages didn't erase what happened, but they gave me something I had never experienced before: the feeling of being heard by the people who once ignored the truth. Then another message appeared, this time a mass email from my parents. They claimed I was inventing everything to gain attention. They insisted Jake had never lied. But before I could respond, relatives forwarded Jake's own message to the group. They shared my grandmother's recording. They defended me in ways I never expected. My parents suddenly ran out of places to hide their narrative. I sat in my apartment overlooking the Portland skyline as the messages kept arriving. The city lights flickered against the window, and for the first time, the weight I had carried since I was 17 shifted. I had crossed a threshold I'd been approaching my entire life. I could feel it. The truth, after 12 long years, finally belonged to me. 3 days passed without a word from my parents or from Jake. The silence wasn't peace, it was retreat. Then my phone rang with a name that surprised me: Aunt Julia, the relative who had always kept her distance from family arguments. Her voice trembled with something like relief as she said, "It's finally clear now, Cassian. It's time for you to come back to the Ward side of the family." It was the first invitation I had received in 12 years. She asked me to spend Thanksgiving with the family in Arizona. For once, returning didn't feel like begging for a place. It felt like stepping into a room where the door had been left open for me all along. The night before I left Portland, I received a letter in the mail with elegant handwriting. It was from Eleanor, my aunt in Manhattan. She wrote that she had long suspected the truth about Jake, but any attempt to intervene had been pushed aside by my parents. She wanted to meet me, not to rewrite the past, but to begin something different. Her last line stayed with me. "You don't need forgiveness to move forward. You only need to know you were never wrong." The next morning, another message arrived, this time from my father. It was blunt, cruel in a way that felt almost familiar. "You've destroyed this family's name. We are done with you." The words didn't sting the way they once would have. Instead, I felt something loosen inside me. It wasn't rejection. It was release. When I arrived in Arizona for Thanksgiving, I didn't know what to expect. But the moment I stepped into the dining room, everyone looked up, paused, and then smiled. They said my name like it mattered. I realized then that family isn't always the people who raise you. Sometimes it's the people who choose the truth when the lie would have been easier. During dinner, one of my younger cousins asked if I could help review his college essay. We spent hours rewriting paragraphs, shaping sentences, talking about who he wanted to become. In guiding him, I felt the echo of my grandmother's voice, the one who placed a notebook in my hands and told me to write my truth. I understood then that what saved me could also save others. When I returned to Portland, I launched Write Your Way Out, a mentoring program and scholarship fund for young people estranged from their families. I taught workshops, read drafts late at night, and poured into others the belief my grandmother had once poured into me. One evening, months later, I received an email from a boy in the program. "Because of you, I got a full scholarship." I sat alone in my apartment reading it, not out of sadness, but gratitude. My life wasn't just healing. It was expanding into something bigger than I ever imagined. Meanwhile, my grandmother's health was fading. I flew back to Taos as often as I could. On my last visit, she sat propped up on her bed, the familiar wooden walls around her. She pressed my old notebook into my hands. "You broke the pattern," she whispered. "You rebuilt what was shattered." After her funeral a month later, I finished the manuscript I had been working on in her honor. A publisher in New York offered a six-figure deal, the same amount my parents once demanded from me. The irony wasn't lost on me. The money went straight into expanding the scholarship fund, reaching more kids than I ever expected. A few weeks later, I stood on the cliffs near the Oregon coast with my laptop open. Waves crashed below, wind tugged at the pages of my journal, and the horizon stretched endlessly ahead. I typed the first lines of my new book and said quietly to myself, "I'm no longer the boy thrown out because of a lie. I'm the writer, the survivor, the keeper of the truth." And with that, I began the next chapter of my life, one shaped not by fear, but by the voice I had fought so long to reclaim. The wind off the Oregon coast cut cold across my face as I stood on the cliff's edge, my laptop warm against my hands. The last sentence I typed still echoed in my mind, not just as words, but as a truth I was finally ready to claim. For a long moment, I simply breathed, steady, unafraid. My chest felt lighter than it had in years, as if the weight of my past had finally loosened its grip. Yet beneath that calm surface, something restless stirred. The familiar mix of relief and uncertainty. The awareness that every ending, no matter how triumphant, carried the seed of the next challenge waiting just out of sight. A part of me expected everything to quiet after exposing the truth, expected the world to give me a moment of stillness. But the quiet I felt on that cliff wasn't peace. It was suspension, the moment between a breath taken and a breath released, the knowing that new battles always arrive disguised as calm. And in that quiet, a question surfaced, one I hadn't dared ask myself before. Now that the truth was mine, what did I want my life to become? In the days that followed, I tried to settle into a sense of normalcy. I wrote in cafes, held meetings for the scholarship program, mentored my students. Each day felt like rebuilding brick by brick. But underneath every conversation, every email, every small success, a new awareness pressed at me. The realization that truth may liberate you, but it also exposes you. People now knew my story. They knew the darker parts, the wounds I carried, the pieces I had spent years trying to heal. It made me visible in a way I wasn't sure I was ready for. And then, the messages began. At first, they were harmless readers thanking me, strangers, sharing their experiences, kids asking for advice. But soon they shifted. Some were from people wanting more than I could give. Some wanted me to fix their sons, their brothers, their broken families. One even wrote, "If you healed yourself, you can heal my child." As though healing had been a formula I'd mastered instead of a battlefield I barely survived. The pressure unsettled me. I found myself double-checking locks, staying late at the office, jumping when my phone buzzed. I wasn't afraid, not exactly. Not. It was something deeper, an unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that being seen came with a cost I hadn't accounted for. But the true conflict arrived quietly, the way storms often do when the sky is deceptively clear. One evening, as I was packing up my things from the co-working space downtown, Melissa called. Her voice held that tone lawyers use when they're trying to be calm, but know the situation isn't. She said a man, no name given at first, had called her office asking questions about me. Whether I was mentally stable, whether the stories about me were true, whether she'd considered the liability of representing someone like that. She asked if I knew anyone who would try to discredit me now that my book was gaining attention. I didn't need time to guess. My father's last message replayed in my mind. "You've destroyed this family's name. We are done with you." Something about the certainty in his words had lingered like a warning. I felt my jaw tighten as I told Melissa I had a suspicion. She sighed, said she'd look into it, and reminded me that when people lose control of a narrative, they often try to rewrite it by force. After the call, an old fear crept in, the fear that no matter how far I ran, I would always hear footsteps behind me. I tried to push it down, but the feeling followed me home. That night, I barely slept. The shadows in my apartment felt longer than usual, stretching across the walls like old memories refusing to fade. The next morning, I threw myself into work. I met with students, reviewed drafts, prepared for an upcoming speaking event in San Diego. I convinced myself that purpose could drown out anxiety. And for a while, it did. But conflict rarely stays dormant. Late that afternoon, as I was leaving a workshop, I spotted an envelope taped to the door of my building. No stamp, no return address. My name handwritten across the front in a pen pressure so heavy the paper was slightly torn. I froze. The air around me thickened as though it carried something I didn't want to breathe in. Inside were printed screenshots of old online posts, ones my family had spread years ago. Claims about my behavior, my supposed outbursts, the fabricated story of the night I was thrown out. At the bottom of the stack was a single note: people don't change as much as you want them to. No signature. But the handwriting, sharp slanted, was unmistakable. My father's. My pulse hammered. I looked around, half expecting him to step from behind a parked car or across the street. But the block was empty. Quiet. Too quiet. The envelope shouldn't have shaken me as much as it did. It wasn't new information. It wasn't an attack I hadn't survived before. But the intention behind it was different now. It wasn't meant to shame me. It was meant to destabilize me. To remind me he still believed he had influence, even if only through fear. I went inside, locked the door, sat at my desk and opened my laptop, not to write, but to breathe, to anchor myself before I unraveled. I knew that if I let this moment define me, I would be 17 again, standing in the hallway of that Santa Fe house with a bag in my hand and no one on my side. And I refused to go back there. I picked up my phone to call Melissa, but before I could dial, another message came in, this time from an unknown number. Only one sentence. "You really think exposing the family was the end of this?" My fingers clenched around the phone. My breath stilled. The past wasn't done. The fight for my truth wasn't finished. And someone, whether my father or someone else, had just made sure I understood that. For a long moment, I sat in the darkening apartment, the weight of the message settling over me. I thought the hardest part of my story was behind me. But life has a way of revealing new shadows the moment you step into the light. Then came the sound that pulled me from my thoughts, a knock at the door. Slow. Deliberate. I didn't have visitors scheduled. I wasn't expecting anyone. And something about the timing the message sent seconds before made every nerve in my body tighten. I stood, heart pounding, moving quietly toward the peephole. But before I reached it, another knock. And a voice I hadn't heard in over a decade spoke through the door. "Cassian, we need to talk." As I stood on that cliffside with the ocean rumbling below, I realized something I never allowed myself to believe: surviving wasn't the end of my story. Choosing who I became afterward, that was the real victory. I lost a family built on silence, but I gained one built on truth. I lost the version of myself shaped by fear, but I found the one shaped by purpose. And as I step into whatever comes next, I carry the lessons that saved me: that honesty is worth the cost, that healing is rarely gentle, and that sometimes walking away is the most courageous thing a person can do. If you've ever been pushed aside, mislabeled, or silenced, I hope my story shows you this: your voice has power even when no one believes you yet. Before I close this chapter, I'd love to know you're here with me. Drop a simple hi in the comments, or tell me where you're watching from. Knowing someone out there is listening makes every word worth it. And if my story resonates with you, please subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. I'm Cassian, and I'm grateful you stayed to hear the truth.